The morning air was crisp as Emma and her mother, Lily, stepped out of their car and walked toward the grand courthouse. Emma, barely 3 years old, held her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers curled around Lily's palm. Her wide eyes darted around, taking in the towering stone columns, the polished steps, and the flurry of people moving purposefully inside. For a child so young, the courthouse was both fascinating and intimidating. A place that smelled faintly of wood polish and authority, a world far removed from her toys and nursery rhymes. Inside, the marble floors echoed with each step they took. Lawyers and clerks in suits bustled past them, carrying thick folders of documents, murmuring in serious tones. Officers in crisp uniforms stood near the entrances, observing visitors with disciplined attention. The air was filled with a strange mixture of anxiety, formality, and hushed anticipation. Emma's small stature made her almost invisible at first glance, but the innocence and curiosity in her eyes soon caught the attention of several adults who couldn't help but notice her. Emma's gaze immediately found Rex, a massive Belgian sitting obediently beside his handler near the front of the courtroom. His coat gleamed under the soft courtroom lighting, and his eyes, intelligent and alert, scanned the room. Rex was a trained police dog, renowned for his skills in detection, tracking, and protection. To most adults, he was an imposing figure, powerful, disciplined, and highly focused. But to Emma, he was nothing short of fascinating. She tilted her head, studying him carefully, as though trying to understand the mystery behind his calm, commanding presence. Lily knelt slightly to whisper in her daughter's ear, "Emma, honey, sit still. We're here to see the judge, remember." But Emma barely registered the words. Her attention was entirely consumed by the dog. She tugged lightly at her mother's sleeve, pointing toward Rex. "Mommy, doggy," she said, her tiny voice filled with wonder. It was a simple statement, but in the quiet, tense environment of the courtroom, it carried an unexpected weight. The adults nearby glanced over, some smiling discreetly at her candidness, others slightly annoyed by the disruption. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression softened by crow's feet around his eyes, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the small girl. There was something in her fearless gaze that caught him off guard. Here was a child, not even able to walk without assistance for long distances, standing in the midst of a place designed for adults who understood rules, procedures, and decorum. And yet, she seemed unbothered by the intimidating room, unafraid of the officers, lawyers, or the courtroom itself. Emma squirmed slightly in her mother's arms, her curiosity bubbling over. She leaned forward, pointing at Rex again. "Big dog," she said, almost as if she were stating a fact. The courtroom murmured softly. Some adults chuckled quietly, while others exchanged polite smiles, realizing that her innocent curiosity had managed to pierce the usual formality. The officer handling Rex noticed her gaze and leaned down slightly, speaking gently. "He's a good dog, trained to help keep people safe." Emma's eyes widened even further. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging the seriousness of his work, though in her own way, completely unburdened by the adult understanding of danger. Lily squeezed her hand, a mixture of pride and nervousness washing over her. She had never seen Emma so fearless, so attentive to a situation she barely understood. Yet, the confidence emanating from her tiny frame was undeniable. The courtroom continued its usual hum of activity. Lawyers whispered to each other, arranging papers and murmuring strategy. The stenographer's fingers flew over the keys of her machine, recording every word spoken. Spectators, waiting for their own hearings or observing proceedings, glanced occasionally at the little girl, some with curiosity, others with amusement. Even among the seriousness of legal affairs, Emma's presence had a strange, humanizing effect. She reminded everyone that life, at its core, was sometimes about wonder, observation, and the courage to simply be. Emma's gaze never left Rex. She crouched slightly, a natural instinct, mimicking the way she had seen dogs behave in books and at the park. Her small head tilted, eyes locked on his, trying to figure out if he would respond to her silently communicated challenge. Rex, trained to ignore distractions, remained calm, but his ears twitched, sensing something unusual. Most adults would have missed the subtle acknowledgement of her presence from a highly trained police dog, but Lily noticed. Her daughter had a rare quality. She could connect with living beings instinctively, without words, without instructions. As the judge called the court to order, signaling the beginning of the day's hearings, Emma remained quiet for a brief moment, observing the room. The contrast between her small size and the grandeur of the courtroom, the seriousness of the adults, and the imposing presence of Rex created a surreal tableau. Every adult present felt a subtle shift in atmosphere. Where tension and formality had dominated just moments before, a new element entered: curiosity, courage, and the unexpected power of innocence. The judge began reading the docket, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward Emma. Her mother, aware of this, tried to keep her engaged with small whispers, soft squeezes, gentle reminders to sit quietly. But Emma was not one to be easily distracted. Her small voice rose again, asking, "Doggy, help." The simplicity of the question carried profound weight in the room. It wasn't just about a police dog. It was about understanding, empathy, and a perspective untouched by cynicism or pretense. The officer handling Rex leaned closer to his canine partner, speaking quietly. "He's here to help the people, little one," he said, pointing toward Rex. Emma nodded, absorbing the information with the intensity only a child could muster. Her curiosity was not fleeting. It was focused, deliberate, and fearless. Even in a room dominated by adults accustomed to authority, her presence commanded attention. People in the courtroom whispered softly, remarking on how remarkable it was to see such fearlessness in a child so young. Emma's mother looked down at her daughter, marveling at her bravery. She had raised Emma to be kind, confident, and curious, but seeing her interact with the imposing environment of a courtroom was another level entirely. Here was a little girl, unaware of the weight of legal proceedings, unburdened by social norms or fear, engaging directly with a trained police dog as if they were equals. And for that brief moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of tension, but a stage for a tiny human to display courage and authenticity. As the proceedings began officially, the judge cleared his throat and addressed the room. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, and the familiar sounds of legal work filled the space once again. Yet in the midst of it all, Emma remained a small, luminous presence, quietly observing, occasionally whispering questions, and never losing her focus on Rex. Adults noticed. Officers noticed. Even the judge, despite years of experience, found himself intrigued by her unfiltered honesty and the calm, almost reverent attention of Rex. By the time the first case was called, the courtroom had subtly shifted. The tension that usually filled the air with formality and rigidity had softened. Emma's fearless presence and innocent curiosity had introduced an unexpected warmth. Even Rex, the disciplined K9, seemed to acknowledge her small but undeniable authority. And so, the stage was set for an encounter that would leave a lasting impression, a moment where innocence, courage, and the unspoken bond between a child and a police dog would quietly, but profoundly, touch everyone in the room. The courtroom had settled into a quiet rhythm, the clicking of typewriters and shuffle of papers forming a steady background hum. But for Emma, the world had narrowed to a single, captivating focus: Rex, the police dog. Her wide brown eyes never wavered from his sleek, alert frame. She leaned forward in her mother's arms, as if inching closer would allow her to understand him better, to see the soul of the dog hidden beneath layers of fur and training. Every small movement, his ear twitching, the soft shift of his weight, was catalogued in her mind with unwavering attention. Lily, trying to maintain control, whispered softly, "Emma, sit still, honey. This is important, remember." But Emma was in a world of her own. She had never seen a dog like Rex, big, strong, disciplined, and yet calm. There was something about the way he sat, with his head held high and his eyes scanning without fear, that fascinated her. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered her own question, "Mommy, why he not bark?" The simplicity of her inquiry drew a soft smile from the officer, who knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "He's trained to stay calm even in the busiest places," the officer explained gently, his voice a low rumble that somehow felt safe. "Rex listens very carefully. He doesn't bark unless he needs to. He protects people." Emma nodded solemnly, tilting her head as if absorbing not just the words but the meaning behind them. In her tiny mind, she was beginning to understand. This wasn't a regular dog. This was a protector, a friend, a being with purpose beyond her toys or the stories in her picture books. The judge, now fully aware of Emma's fascination, adjusted his glasses and allowed himself a quiet chuckle. He had presided over hundreds of cases, seen people stumble under pressure, and witnessed the weight of the law crush adults with ease. But here, in this small, crowded room, a child's curiosity had changed the dynamic. Adults were no longer entirely in control. A tiny girl, barely able to speak in full sentences, had captured attention with nothing more than honesty and wonder. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, intrigued by the way her mind worked, so unfiltered and fearless. Emma's attention was unwavering. She leaned forward again, pointing at Rex with a small, trembling finger. "Doggy, work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea her daughter would engage in this way, and yet she felt a mixture of pride and concern. The courtroom held its collective breath. Even the most stoic lawyers and officers paused to watch. Here was a 3-year-old, fully immersed in the reality of a police dog's life, asking questions that would make many adults pause to think. The officer knelt closer, his uniform brushing against the polished courtroom floor. "Rex helps people stay safe," he said softly. "He finds things that are dangerous and he helps officers keep the city safe. He's very smart and he listens carefully to commands. He only acts when needed." Emma absorbed the words, nodding slowly, her small face scrunched in concentration. Then, with a seriousness that belied her age, she asked, "He help people scared?" The question was simple, but it hung in the air like a profound statement. The officer paused, considering the depth of her insight. "Yes," he said finally, "that's exactly right. He helps people feel safe even when they are scared." Emma's eyes brightened. For a brief moment, she reached out a tiny hand toward Rex as though wanting to thank him. Rex remained calm, his amber eyes following the movement with measured precision. There was a subtle recognition in the dog's gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the small human who dared to reach out in a world of rules, authority, and seriousness. Even adults noticed the connection, a bridge of trust forming in seconds between the child and the trained K9. Whispers spread across the courtroom. Lawyers leaned in to whisper to each other, officers exchanged glances, and even spectators murmured quietly, amazed by the interaction unfolding before them. Emma's mother, both anxious and proud, tried to keep her daughter's attention focused elsewhere, reminding her to stay seated. But Emma was not easily distracted. Her mind was alive with questions, observations, and wonder. Every twitch of Rex's ear, every shift of his weight, was catalogued and pondered with the curiosity of someone far older than her years. The judge, now fully attentive, allowed the moment to continue without interruption. He had seen courtroom distractions before, but nothing like this. Here was a child engaging directly with a trained police dog, fearless and articulate in her way, commanding the attention of adults without even trying. There was something profound in the simplicity of the scene, a reminder that innocence, curiosity, and honesty could pierce through the rigid, sometimes cold, structure of the legal system. The courtroom seemed lighter, as though Emma's presence had gently shifted the atmosphere. Emma's curiosity did not stop with questions about Rex. She leaned closer to Lily and asked quietly, "He sleep here?" The mother's heart raced, realizing her daughter's mind was connecting details she hadn't considered. The officer smiled, crouching slightly to answer. "Rex has a home with me, but he comes here to work. He stays focused during important times, just like you listen to your teacher or your parents." Emma nodded, as if understanding not just the words, but the responsibility that Rex carried. Her small mind was processing the concepts of duty, protection, and courage, far beyond her age. The courtroom watched silently. Adults were amazed at the depth of understanding emanating from such a small child. Emma's questions, innocent though they were, forced a reflection on the world's complexities through the lens of a tiny human. It was a rare moment where adult authority and childlike wonder collided, creating a tableau of sincerity, bravery, and connection. Even Rex's tail twitched slightly, a subtle sign of acknowledgement toward the tiny observer whose curiosity dared to meet his intelligence. Lily, still holding her daughter, felt a swelling pride mixed with a touch of apprehension. She had raised Emma to be inquisitive, fearless, and honest, but she had never seen her daughter engage so fully with a living being trained to command respect and caution. Emma's questions were direct, insightful, and fearless. "Brave," she whispered, pointing at Rex with tiny certainty. The officer looked at her and nodded. "Yes, Emma, he is very brave." Emma's small face broke into a tiny, satisfied smile, her understanding of courage beginning to take root in her young mind. As the judge called the next case, he noticed the way Emma's attention remained unwavering. Her small body leaned slightly toward Rex, eyes shining with admiration. The adults in the room realized that this child, barely old enough to grasp the weight of everyday life, had managed to capture the essence of trust, bravery, and understanding in a single glance. She reminded them that courage does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers in the quiet, fearless curiosity of a 3-year-old who sees the world without the burden of expectation. By the time the initial proceedings began, the atmosphere in the courtroom had subtly shifted. Where tension, formality, and authority had dominated moments before, a quiet warmth now permeated the room. Emma's fascination with Rex, her fearless inquiries, and her genuine innocence had created a bridge between the serious, disciplined world of law and the purity of human curiosity. Adults, officers, and even the judge felt a gentle reminder that sometimes clarity and bravery come from the smallest, least expected voices. Emma, unaware of the impact she had made, continued to watch Rex. Every movement, every glance, every shift in posture was observed with the precision only a child so young could muster. She had unknowingly captured the hearts of everyone in the room, forcing them to see the world through a lens of wonder, honesty, and connection. The officer handling Rex exchanged a quiet glance with the judge, acknowledging the rare magic unfolding before their eyes. Emma's small, fearless presence had turned an ordinary morning in court into something unforgettable. And so the stage was set. A tiny girl with unyielding curiosity had already begun to change the rhythm of the courtroom. The story of Emma and Rex was just beginning, but its impact was undeniable. In the hushed whispers, the subtle smiles, and the unspoken admiration of those present, it was clear. This was no ordinary child, and today was no ordinary courtroom. A journey of courage, innocence, and unexpected bravery was about to unfold, and everyone present would witness it firsthand. The courtroom, which had been warmed by Emma's innocent curiosity, slowly settled into the rhythm of legal proceedings once again. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and the murmurs of spectators became subdued whispers. But beneath the surface, a subtle tension lingered, like the quiet hum of anticipation before a storm. Emma, perched on her mother's lap, remained focused on Rex, her wide brown eyes locked onto the police dog's disciplined form. She was undeterred by the rustle of legal documents, the stern expressions of lawyers, or the low hum of conversation. Her world had narrowed to the presence of this remarkable dog. Lily, sensing that the moment was delicate, tried to gently nudge her daughter's attention elsewhere. "Emma, sweetie, we need to be quiet now," she whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emma's forehead. But Emma had a curiosity that could not be silenced. She leaned slightly forward and whispered, "Doggy work scary." Her words, so small yet profoundly honest, caught the attention of several adults nearby. The courtroom, despite the formality of law and procedure, seemed to pause. Even the officer handling Rex, who had seen countless public interactions, was taken aback by the depth of inquiry in a 3-year-old's voice. The officer knelt closer to the polished courtroom floor, maintaining the calm demeanor expected of a professional. "Rex does his work to keep people safe," he explained patiently. "Some jobs are dangerous, yes, but he's trained to stay focused. He doesn't get scared because he trusts his training and the people around him." Emma's tiny brow furrowed in thought. She processed the concept of fear and courage, abstract ideas she had not yet encountered in her daily life. For her, understanding Rex's bravery meant recognizing the strength in someone who could act despite fear, a lesson far deeper than most 3-year-olds could grasp. Across the courtroom, whispers spread. Lawyers and spectators exchanged subtle glances, noting the unusual scene unfolding. A child's innocence had pierced the rigid walls of law and authority, forcing adults to reconsider what they thought they knew about fear, courage, and understanding. Even the judge, a man accustomed to weighing evidence, statements, and legal arguments with precise authority, leaned forward slightly in his chair. There was something magnetic about Emma's presence, an unfiltered, raw honesty that demanded attention without effort. Emma's fascination with Rex only grew. She leaned slightly, squinting her eyes and whispering, "No danger." Her mother squeezed her hand nervously, aware that Emma's questions, while innocent, were beginning to elicit more than just polite smiles. They were prompting reflection. The officer crouched slightly, speaking directly to her. "Yes, Emma, Rex can sense when danger is near. That's why he's so important. He works to protect people before they get hurt." Emma's eyes widened as if a new understanding had been unlocked. She nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of the statement while remaining unafraid. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted. Adults who had been solely focused on paperwork, proceedings, and protocol now found themselves captivated by the small girl and the enormous dog. Emma's questions were simple, but the meaning behind them was profound. Here was a child, unburdened by adult preconceptions, recognizing the essence of courage and responsibility. The power dynamics of the room, the officers, the lawyers, the judge, were subtly upended by the presence of someone so tiny, so fearless, so unfiltered. A lawyer at the back of the room whispered to a colleague, "It's incredible she's not afraid of that dog at all." His colleague nodded, whispering back, "And yet, she's teaching all of us something about bravery without even trying." Even spectators, who had initially come for routine hearings, found themselves watching Emma with rapt attention. There was a magnetic quality to the scene, a 3-year-old connecting instinctively with a highly trained animal in a world dominated by adults. Emma, unaware of the attention she had garnered, continued to lean slightly forward, her tiny hands resting on her knees. She tilted her head as she studied Rex, and then softly asked, "He help people happy?" Lily's breath caught. Her daughter's question was simple but profound. The concept of happiness in a world full of rules, danger, and responsibility was something most adults struggled to articulate. And yet Emma, with her innocence, had distilled it perfectly. Courage was not only about facing fear, but about helping others feel safe and comforted. Rex, sensing the sincerity of her tone and presence, shifted slightly but remained calm. His amber eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, a connection seemed to pass between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. The officer smiled subtly, marveling at the rare interaction. He had trained with Rex for years, seen him respond to thousands of situations, but nothing compared to the calm yet purposeful acknowledgement of a child's presence. Emma had drawn out a gentleness in the dog, a trust born of pure, fearless curiosity. The judge, observing quietly, allowed the moment to linger. He had presided over hundreds of cases, many tense, some tragic and others mundane. Yet this small human standing, seated or perched on a lap, quietly engaging with a trained police dog, was unlike anything he had seen. It was a reminder that law, procedure, and authority, though essential, were not always the most powerful forces in the room. Sometimes the simplest human truths, curiosity, innocence, honesty, could command more attention than any legal argument. Emma, emboldened by the calm demeanor of Rex, leaned closer to Lily and whispered, "He strong." Lily nodded gently, unsure how to respond without breaking the courtroom's decorum. The officer, overhearing, added, "Yes, Emma, he's very strong, but his strength comes from his training and his heart. He uses it to protect, not to harm." Emma's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. In her mind, strength was now defined not by size or power alone, but by courage, calmness, and the ability to help others. Whispers rippled across the courtroom again. Spectators, officers, and even some lawyers found themselves reflecting on the small child's perspective. What was bravery? What was strength? How often did adults fail to understand these qualities in their form? Emma, without even realizing it, had forced the room to pause and reconsider fundamental truths that many had long overlooked. A single 3-year-old had managed to command attention, admiration, and reflection, all with her fearless curiosity and unfiltered questions. The officer handling Rex exchanged a glance with his colleagues. "She's something special," one murmured softly. Rex, attuned to the human presence, remained calm yet aware. He had sensed fear, excitement, and curiosity countless times, but the steadiness of Emma's attention and the softness of her voice created an unusual calm, a mutual acknowledgement that neither human nor dog could fully explain. There was a rare balance in the room, a moment of harmony amidst the structured chaos of legal procedure. Lily looked down at her daughter, pride and awe swelling in her chest. She had always known Emma was courageous, inquisitive, and bright, but this fearless engagement with a trained police dog in the heart of a courtroom surpassed any expectation. Emma's mind, so young yet so observant, had already begun to grasp lessons about trust, responsibility, and the nature of fear and courage. And the adults around her were learning, too. As the hearing progressed, Emma remained focused, occasionally whispering small questions, each one sparking quiet reflection among the adults present. The courtroom, once dominated by formality and tension, now hummed with subtle warmth. Emma had shifted the energy, not through force or words, but through her presence, her curiosity, and her unshakable fearlessness. Even the judge felt a rare sense of admiration, acknowledging silently that the smallest voice sometimes carried the greatest weight. By the time the first major proceedings began, it was clear that Emma's curiosity had left an indelible mark. Adults found themselves glancing at her occasionally, smiling discreetly, marveling at the courage and insight displayed by someone so young. Rex, calm and composed, seemed to understand the importance of the moment, maintaining his focus while acknowledging Emma's presence. And in the quiet, profound way that only children can achieve, Emma had begun to teach everyone in the courtroom about trust, bravery, and the extraordinary clarity of a child's perspective. The day's hearings continued, but the memory of Emma's fearless inquiries lingered in every corner of the room. Lawyers spoke with more patience, officers observed with more empathy, and even the judge carried a softened expression, reminded that courage and understanding sometimes came from the smallest, most unexpected sources. And Emma. She continued to watch Rex, unaware of the impact she had made, her mind alive with questions, wonder, and the quiet courage that would soon lead to an unforgettable confrontation. The courtroom had settled into a tense quiet, the earlier hum of curiosity now replaced by a palpable anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers nervously, officers remained alert, and spectators sat in their seats, all eyes unconsciously drawn toward the small figure in the front, Emma. She had been observing Rex intently for what felt like hours, though in reality it had only been moments. Her tiny hands rested gently on her mother's arm, but her mind was alive with thoughts far beyond her 3 years. She wasn't afraid, far from it. She was ready. Emma's gaze locked onto Rex's amber eyes. There was a connection now, subtle but undeniable, formed through minutes of quiet observation, whispered questions, and her fearless presence. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing something unusual was about to happen. Even the judge, who had presided over thousands of cases and seen countless unusual events, leaned slightly forward, a hint of anticipation in his eyes. There was something in the way Emma studied Rex that suggested the ordinary rules of decorum, were about to be gently disrupted. She pointed at Rex with a small but determined finger. "Good dog," she said, her voice barely above a whisper yet filled with clarity. The courtroom froze. Every adult, every officer, every lawyer turned their attention toward her, suddenly aware that the room had shifted. It was astonishing how two simple words, spoken with untainted honesty and fearless intent, could command the attention of dozens of adults. Even Rex, trained to respond only to his handler, tilted his head slightly, as if recognizing the truth and kindness behind the statement. A hush settled over the courtroom. The judge's stern face softened, his eyebrows lifting in quiet surprise. He had expected distractions, interruptions, perhaps even misbehavior, but he had not expected this. A 3-year-old asserting herself so calmly and commanding presence, not through volume or authority, but through courage and honesty. There was something magical in the way Emma had bridged the gap between child and beast, innocence and discipline. Even the officers, hardened by years of experience, could not hide their awe. The officer handling Rex knelt slightly closer, keeping a hand near the dog while giving a gentle, approving smile to Emma. "You're very kind," he said softly, his voice steady yet warm. "Rex knows that." Emma nodded, her wide eyes never leaving the dog's. She had not spoken in full sentences, had not made demands, but her presence and words carried a weight beyond her years. There was something instinctive about her interaction, an understanding that courage, kindness, and respect were more powerful than fear or authority. Whispers rippled quietly through the courtroom. Spectators leaned forward, murmuring to each other, marveling at the rare and unexpected connection. Lawyers stopped shuffling papers, observing instead, their professional rigidity softened by the sight of a small human influencing a situation with such simplicity. Emma's mother, Lily, held her daughter's hand tightly, a mixture of pride, nervousness, and astonishment flooding her heart. She had raised a brave, curious child, but this level of courage, this fearless engagement, was something extraordinary. Emma, emboldened by Rex's calm reaction, leaned slightly forward, her small face serious and focused. "Doggy, help?" she asked again, this time with a gentle firmness that seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. Her mother felt a shiver run down her spine, realizing that Emma's curiosity and fearlessness were about to reach their climax. The officer crouched closer to provide reassurance, explaining again that Rex helped people, kept them safe, and never acted out of fear. Each word seemed to resonate deeply with Emma, who nodded slowly as if absorbing a lesson in courage and empathy. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma shifted her tiny weight forward and looked directly at Rex. "You good dog," she said again, her tone firm yet tender. The effect was instantaneous. The courtroom, which had already softened in the presence of the child's curiosity, now became almost reverential. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, a small, incredulous smile spreading across his face. The officer, trained to remain impassive, felt a swell of pride. Rex had acknowledged the words, the intent, the presence of someone so small yet so profoundly honest. Emma's statement, though brief, held something remarkable. It commanded respect without demanding it, bridged the human and animal worlds without force, and reminded every adult present that courage could come in the smallest packages. Rex shifted slightly, his ears twitching, a subtle sign of recognition that only those who truly observed closely could notice. The quiet, fearless confidence of a child had penetrated the walls of formality and authority, creating a rare, almost sacred moment of connection. The judge, recovering his composure, leaned back in his chair but kept his gaze on Emma. "Young lady," he said softly, "would you like to come closer?" Emma's mother blinked in surprise. She had not expected the judge to engage so personally, yet she felt an odd sense of pride and trust. "Emma," Lily whispered, "you can go ahead if you want." Emma stood slowly, clutching her mother's hand, and took tentative steps toward the front of the courtroom. Each step felt monumental, her small feet carrying her into the attention of dozens of adults and one exceptionally well-trained police dog. The spectators watched in silence. The adults, accustomed to controlling proceedings and commanding respect, were now observing a tiny human asserting her presence through innocence, clarity, and courage. Emma approached Rex with careful steps, her eyes wide, her expression serious. She crouched slightly, bringing herself closer to his level without fear. The officer smiled subtly, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, recognizing that this was more than a child-dog interaction. It was a lesson in trust, bravery, and the purity of unfiltered communication. "Hello, Rex," Emma whispered softly, reaching her small hand toward him. The dog, calm and composed, allowed her proximity, his large head lowering slightly in acknowledgement. The courtroom held its collective breath. It was as if time had slowed. Adults, spectators, and even the judge felt the profound simplicity of the moment. A child and a dog communicating without words, teaching lessons about courage, kindness, and the quiet power of honesty. Emma's gaze never wavered. She looked up at the judge and then back at Rex, her small fingers brushing against his fur. The room was silent, save for the faint shuffle of papers and the soft whirring of the air conditioning. No one dared speak. The sheer bravery of this tiny human, unafraid to step forward, to confront something so large and disciplined with nothing but truth and fearlessness, had stunned the courtroom. Finally, Emma spoke again, her tiny voice carrying across the room with clarity. "You help people." The words, simple as they were, resonated with every adult present. Lawyers, officers, and spectators alike felt the truth behind them. Courage did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered through the innocence and clarity of a child who understood the essence of trust, protection, and kindness. Rex, ever attentive, wagged his tail slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection formed in that moment. The judge, visibly moved, allowed a small, warm smile to spread across his face. "Indeed, young lady," he said gently, "he does help people, and you are very brave to recognize it." The courtroom, which had been tense and formal, was now softened, warmed by the rare intersection of innocence, bravery, and respect. Emma's mother exhaled quietly, proud beyond words. Her daughter had faced the intimidating presence of a trained police dog, and every adult in the room, with courage, kindness, and honesty. It was a moment no one would forget. Emma had not spoken in long sentences, had not demanded attention, but her bravery, clarity, and fearless curiosity had captivated everyone present. Even the officer handling Rex, seasoned and disciplined, felt an uncommon swell of emotion. The courtroom, once filled with the cold hum of procedure and authority, now vibrated with warmth, respect, and a quiet reverence for the smallest among them. Emma, sensing the approval and calm, smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and satisfaction in her expression. Rex, trained to act on command and instinct, remained calm but subtly attentive, acknowledging the tiny human who had approached without fear, commanded respect without words, and left an indelible mark on everyone present. It was a quiet, profound triumph of courage, innocence, and understanding, a moment where the simplest truths carried the greatest weight. The day's proceedings would continue, but the memory of this encounter, the boldness of a tiny 3-year-old, the calm acknowledgement of a trained police dog, and the softened awe of the courtroom, would linger in every mind present. Emma's courage had shifted the energy of the room, creating a bridge between innocence and authority, child and adult, human and animal. And in that bridge, something extraordinary had emerged, a lesson in the quiet, fearless power of honesty, curiosity, and empathy. The courtroom, still vibrating with the quiet intensity of Emma's bold words, fell into a rare, reflective silence. The adults present, from lawyers to spectators to officers, were momentarily suspended in awe, caught between admiration and disbelief. Emma had done something extraordinary. She had confronted a highly trained police dog with fearlessness and sincerity, and had left everyone, humans and canine alike, in reverent pause. Rex, obedient as ever, remained still, but the subtle tilt of his head and gentle wag of his tail acknowledged the small human's bravery. The judge, a man whose life was dominated by rules, procedures, and legal complexities, leaned back slightly in his chair. His stern demeanor had softened, replaced with a quiet warmth and curiosity. He was fully aware that this was no ordinary courtroom moment. In decades of presiding over trials, hearings, and disputes, he had rarely witnessed a display of courage and insight so pure, so untouched by ego or pretense. Here was a 3-year-old, seated on her mother's lap moments ago, now standing fearlessly before the courtroom, bridging the chasm between child and authority, innocence and discipline. He cleared his throat gently, not wanting to disrupt the delicate balance of attention that hung in the air. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with his usual authority, "would you like to come closer?" Lily's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at her daughter, whose wide eyes flickered with curiosity and trust. Emma nodded slowly, gripping her mother's hand, her tiny fingers curling around Lily's in a quiet acknowledgement of support. The judge gestured softly toward the front of the courtroom, inviting Emma to step forward. Emma's small feet made tentative but deliberate steps across the polished floor, her eyes never leaving Rex's calm gaze. Each step seemed monumental in the hushed courtroom, as if the world itself had slowed to watch. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, lawyers paused mid-note, and officers straightened, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. Emma's presence commanded attention not through volume or authority, but through sheer honesty and the quiet confidence of a child unafraid of the unknown. As Emma reached the front, the judge extended a hand gently. "Come closer," he said, his voice steady yet warm. Emma glanced at her mother briefly, who offered an encouraging nod. Slowly, Emma stepped closer to the bench, her tiny stature in stark contrast to the grandiosity of the courtroom around her. She crouched slightly, bringing herself closer to Rex's level, her eyes wide, reflecting both awe and fearless curiosity. The officer handling Rex watched quietly, sensing that this was a rare and delicate moment of connection between child and dog. "Hello, Emma," the judge said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I've been watching you. You're very brave, aren't you?" Emma tilted her head thoughtfully, considering the question. She glanced at Rex, who sat obediently, calm but attentive, and then back at the judge. "Brave?" she asked in her tiny voice, almost questioning the meaning of the word. Lily suppressed a giggle, amazed at how her daughter processed the abstract concept of courage. The judge nodded. "Yes, brave. It means doing the right thing, even when something feels big or scary. Like Rex, he is brave because he helps people, even when it's difficult or dangerous." Emma's eyes widened in comprehension. She reached a tiny hand toward Rex, brushing gently against his fur, as if confirming that she understood not just his actions, but the essence of courage itself. Rex remained still, almost reverently, sensing the sincerity and fearlessness emanating from the small human before him. The courtroom's tension softened further. Spectators leaned forward, exchanging quiet whispers. Lawyers who had spent years mastering arguments and courtroom strategies found themselves marveling at the simplicity and depth of Emma's courage. Officers, accustomed to high-pressure situations, exchanged glances, acknowledging the rare magic of the moment. And the judge, a man whose life revolved around structure and order, felt something he rarely experienced in a courtroom, a profound sense of humility. Emma, emboldened by the judge's gentle tone, spoke again, her small voice filled with clarity. "Doggy help?" she asked, pointing toward Rex. Her mother's heart leapt again. Emma had distilled complex ideas into a simple question. The officer crouched slightly, his hand resting lightly near Rex, responding with care. "Yes, Emma," he said. "He helps people stay safe. That is why he works. And he's very brave, just like you are when you try new things." Emma nodded slowly, absorbing the words, her tiny face serious with understanding. Judge leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. "Emma," he said, "do you know something? Sometimes adults forget the simplest things. We forget that being kind, being honest, and having courage are more important than just rules or paperwork." Emma's eyes sparkled as she processed the words. She reached out a tiny hand and patted Rex gently, a gesture that conveyed both gratitude and recognition. The dog responded with a subtle tilt of his head, his calm demeanor acknowledging the connection. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft whir of the air conditioning and the faint shuffle of papers. The adults present felt the weight of the lesson unfolding before them. Courage, kindness, honesty, qualities often spoken of in theory, were now demonstrated by a 3-year-old. Emma had not shouted, demanded attention, or sought recognition. She had simply observed, asked questions, and engaged with honesty. And in doing so, she had taught a room full of adults a lesson in empathy, bravery, and human connection. Emma's mother, Lily, felt a swell of pride and awe. Her daughter, small and unassuming, had stepped into a world dominated by rules and authority and left an indelible mark. She had not only engaged a trained police dog fearlessly, but had also softened the hearts of every adult present. Lawyers whispered quietly to each other, officers nodded subtly, and spectators watched in quiet reverence. Even the judge, seasoned and authoritative, smiled warmly, realizing that this moment would remain with him far longer than any case he had ever presided over. "Emma," the judge continued, his voice calm and kind, "you have done something very special. You have shown courage, kindness, and understanding, and you have reminded all of us that even the smallest voices can make a big difference." Emma's small fingers brushed again against Rex's fur, and she looked up at the judge with a tiny, confident smile. She had not fully understood the gravity of her actions, but she sensed the importance of the acknowledgement. Rex shifted slightly, his ears twitching, acknowledging her bravery. The officer handling him gave a quiet nod of approval. The courtroom, once filled with tension, had transformed into a space of reflection, warmth, and silent admiration. Emma's presence had reminded everyone of the power of honesty, the courage of the innocent, and the beauty of simple, fearless engagement. Even the judge, usually stoic and measured, felt a rare sense of emotional resonance, knowing that this 3-year-old had done something extraordinary in her quiet, unassuming way. Finally, Emma's mother whispered, "Time to sit, honey." Emma, still glowing with the quiet triumph of her bold engagement, nodded and returned to her seat. But the room remained changed. The judge straightened slightly, officers exchanged subtle, impressed glances, and spectators murmured quietly among themselves. A lesson had been delivered, not through lectures or formalities, but through the fearless curiosity and honesty of a 3-year-old who had dared to confront something bigger than herself, and in doing so had captured hearts. The judge cleared his throat, returning the courtroom to order, but a subtle warmth lingered. Emma had shown that courage could be gentle, bravery could be silent, and influence could come from the smallest of sources. The impact of her actions resonated with everyone, from officers to lawyers to spectators, and even Rex seemed to recognize the extraordinary bond formed in that brief encounter. Emma had left a mark, one that would be remembered far longer than any single case or ruling in that courtroom. And so, as the day's hearings continued, the courtroom carried a quiet, enduring magic. Emma had engaged, questioned, and observed with a fearlessness that belied her age. She had bridged the human and animal world, reminded adults of the power of honesty and courage, and transformed a rigid courtroom into a space of reflection, empathy, and awe. Her bravery had been quiet but profound, and the impact would ripple far beyond the polished floors and wooden benches of the courthouse. The courtroom, still buzzing with the quiet aftershocks of Emma's bold interaction with Rex, settled into an unusual, reflective energy. Where moments ago the room had been dominated by rigid formality, paperwork, hushed murmurs, and authoritative commands, it now carried an almost tangible warmth. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, their eyes frequently flicking toward the small girl who had become the heart of the room. Emma, unaware of the impact she had made, continued to watch Rex attentively, her tiny hands folded neatly in her lap, her wide brown eyes shining with wonder. The officers and lawyers, who had been trained to remain disciplined and detached, found themselves quietly influenced by the presence of the child. The officer handling Rex exchanged subtle glances with colleagues, each nodding in recognition of what they had just witnessed. Emma had done more than engage a trained police dog. She had reminded adults of lessons they had long since buried under layers of protocol, experience, and the weight of authority. Bravery was not about dominance, she seemed to say. It was about honesty, curiosity, and empathy. Lily, seated beside her daughter, felt a mix of awe and nervousness. She had watched Emma approach Rex, hear her speak to him, and witness the subtle acknowledgement from the dog that had left the entire courtroom in quiet admiration. Emma's fearlessness was extraordinary, but it was also entirely natural. She had not been taught to act in this way. It came from within, a pure, instinctive courage that no adult could manufacture. Lily squeezed her daughter's hand gently, whispering, "You're amazing, honey," knowing the words were both praise and reassurance. Across the courtroom, spectators began to murmur softly among themselves. Conversations, previously hushed and routine, now carried notes of astonishment and admiration. "Did you see that?" whispered one woman. "She's only 3 years old and just wow," replied a man sitting behind her. Lawyers paused mid-note, some closing their folders momentarily to observe, others whispering quietly to colleagues. Even the judge, returning to the official proceedings, found himself glancing toward Emma occasionally, a subtle smile lingering on his face. The ripple effect extended beyond mere admiration. Emma's presence had changed the atmosphere of the courtroom entirely. Officers approached their duties with a newfound patience, softening their normally rigid expressions. Lawyers, who had entered expecting a routine day of litigation, found themselves reflecting on the lessons of courage and honesty demonstrated by someone so young. Spectators who had come expecting routine proceedings were now silently taking notes on the quiet impact of bravery, empathy, and the power of simplicity. Emma, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the adult fascination surrounding her. Her focus was entirely on Rex, observing his calm demeanor and processing what she had learned. "He happy," she whispered quietly, tilting her head. The officer handling Rex knelt slightly closer. "Yes, Emma," he said softly. "He's happy because he is helping people and doing his job well, and he knows you are kind." Emma's lips curved into a faint smile. She understood kindness in the most basic terms: gentle touch, careful words, and respect. In her tiny mind, she was beginning to comprehend that courage and kindness often went hand in hand. As the day's proceedings continued, Emma's presence subtly influenced the tone of each hearing. Adults spoke more gently, listened more attentively, and even found themselves pausing to consider the simplicity of truth in her interactions. A lawyer, who had previously been frustrated by a procedural delay, softened when he noticed Emma observing from the front. Her quiet bravery reminded him that authority and control were not the only measures of impact. Kindness, sincerity, and observation carried weight that could be far more profound. The judge, observing the courtroom carefully, recognized that the impact of Emma's actions was rippling outward. He paused between rulings, glancing toward her with quiet approval. She had reminded him, and everyone present, that courage need not roar. It could whisper, it could smile, it could be observed in the simplest of gestures. Emma's interaction with Rex had become a subtle but powerful example. Actions rooted in honesty and empathy could influence even the most structured, rule-bound environments. Even Rex seemed affected by the presence of the small human. He remained calm, obedient, and disciplined, yet there was a subtle acknowledgement in his movements, a slight tilt of the head, a gentle wag of the tail, that reflected the quiet bond forming between them. Emma's fearlessness had earned his respect, and the connection between child and dog was palpable. The courtroom, previously dominated by formality and rigidity, had shifted to a space where trust, bravery, and respect were now the unspoken laws. As hours passed, the ripple effects became even more evident. The officers handling the proceedings found themselves pausing to smile at small acts of kindness, reminding themselves of the humanity that often went unnoticed in their work. Lawyers engaged with witnesses and clients more patiently, influenced by the reminder that courage and empathy often carried more weight than sharp arguments. Spectators, too, carried a new awareness, whispering quietly among themselves about the small girl who had quietly transformed their perception of bravery and understanding. Emma, still observing Rex, whispered another simple question. "He's scared." The officer knelt, his voice gentle. "No, Emma, he's not scared because he trusts his training and the people around him. Bravery isn't about never being scared, it's about doing what's right even when you are." Emma absorbed the words with a seriousness that belied her age. She nodded slowly, understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the presence of careful, intentional action. The judge, observing this exchange, allowed a quiet moment of reflection to linger. He had presided over countless hearings, each with its own drama and significance, yet rarely had he witnessed a moment so pure, so human, and so quietly profound. Emma had reminded everyone present of a fundamental truth, that courage, empathy, and kindness were not measured by size, authority, or experience, but by the willingness to act with sincerity, honesty, and observation. The ripple effect extended beyond the courtroom walls. Staff, once focused solely on efficiency, paused to notice small acts of consideration and understanding. The atmosphere of tension softened, replaced by subtle acknowledgement of the lessons Emma had imparted. Adults began to converse more gently, offering reassurance to one another, reflecting on the ways in which bravery and kindness intersected in daily life. Emma's influence, though unspoken, was pervasive. Even the spectators, who had initially come expecting routine proceedings, found themselves impacted. They whispered among themselves, exchanging quiet reflections on the courage of a small child and the calm dignity of a trained police dog. Emma's presence had forced everyone to reconsider assumptions about power, authority, and influence. Here was a 3-year-old, fearless yet gentle, teaching a room full of adults about honesty, bravery, and empathy, without ever raising her voice or demanding recognition. As the day wore on, Emma remained engaged but content, observing, asking simple questions, and learning through careful, unfiltered observation. Her mother watched in awe, realizing that Emma had not only connected with Rex but had influenced the hearts and minds of every adult present. Emma's quiet bravery had become a subtle force, transforming the courtroom from a space of routine authority into a space of reflection, empathy, and human connection. Finally, as the day's proceedings began to wind down, the judge called a brief pause. "Ladies and," he said, his voice calm yet resonant, "today we have witnessed something extraordinary. A small child has reminded us of the most important lessons of our lives: courage, honesty, and kindness. Let us carry that lesson forward." The courtroom fell into respectful silence, each adult reflecting on the quiet power of innocence, empathy, and fearless curiosity. Emma, unaware of the weight of her influence, smiled faintly and reached out once more to Rex. The dog responded with a gentle tilt of his head, acknowledging the trust, bravery, and understanding they had shared. The ripple effect of Emma's courage had already begun, soft, quiet, yet undeniable. The courtroom would not be the same. The adults, officers, and spectators present had been reminded that the smallest voice could carry immense power, that bravery was not measured in size or authority, and that kindness could resonate far beyond the act itself. And in that quiet, profound moment, Emma returned to her mother's lap, satisfied with the lessons she had learned and the connections she had made. She had confronted the intimidating presence of a highly trained police dog, observed the world with fearless curiosity, and left an indelible mark on everyone in the room. The ripple effects of her bravery would continue long after the echoes of the day faded, a reminder that courage, kindness, and honesty often arrive in the smallest, most unexpected forms. The courtroom had transformed. What began as a standard, orderly legal proceeding had become something far more extraordinary. Emma, a tiny 3-year-old, had captured the attention, respect, and awe of every adult in the room through nothing more than her curiosity, courage, and honesty. The ripple effects of her interactions with Rex, the trained police dog, had altered the very energy of the space. Lawyers paused in mid-discussion, officers straightened with a newfound patience, and even the judge, a man accustomed to authority and procedure, found himself reflecting on the lessons of bravery that no law book could teach. Emma, seated again on her mother's lap, had not fully grasped the scale of her impact. though she sensed the subtle shifts in the room. Her wide brown eyes, bright with curiosity, remained fixed on Rex, who sat obediently but attentively, occasionally flicking his ears in response to her gaze. The bond between child and dog had grown stronger with each small gesture, a whispered question, a gentle touch, a simple acknowledgement of courage. In the calmness of Rex's presence, Emma had found both inspiration and reassurance. The judge, observing quietly, allowed the courtroom to pause, recognizing that Emma's presence had introduced a rare and profound lesson. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, his expression softened by admiration. "Emma," he began, his voice gentle yet carrying authority, "you have shown all of us something important today. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the actions of the smallest among us. You have reminded us that kindness, honesty, and bravery are the foundations of true strength." Emma tilted her head, absorbing the judge's words as best she could. Though she was only 3, she had an intuitive understanding of what he meant. Courage, she realized, was about acting with honesty and sincerity, even when others seemed bigger or more powerful. Kindness was not just a word, it was a gesture, a connection, a deliberate choice to recognize the value of others. And bravery, she now understood, was not about fearlessness alone, but about the willingness to act despite fear. The courtroom's atmosphere was electric yet subtle. The adults, officers, and spectators who had been witnesses to Emma's quiet courage felt a collective shift within themselves. Conversations became softer, actions more deliberate, and interactions more thoughtful. Even the most hardened officers, who had faced danger and adversity countless times, found themselves reflecting on the lessons of this small human, who had fearlessly engaged with a trained, disciplined animal and commanded the attention of an entire room. Emma, emboldened by the calm acceptance of her bravery, leaned slightly forward again, whispering to Rex, "You brave dog." Her words, simple yet profoundly honest, elicited a subtle response from the dog. Rex's ears twitched, his tail gave a small wag, and his amber eyes locked with hers in a silent acknowledgement of mutual respect. The officer handling Rex, who had seen countless interactions with the dog, paused in quiet awe. This was no ordinary bond. This was a rare, unspoken understanding that bridged age, species, and experience. The judge's voice carried softly over the murmurs of the courtroom. "Emma," he said, "would you like to tell us more about what you see and understand?" Lily, sensing the magnitude of the moment, nodded gently to her daughter. Emma took a deep breath, her small chest rising as she prepared to speak in her own words. She glanced briefly at Rex, then back at the judge, her tiny fingers fidgeting slightly. "He help people happy," she said, her voice clear and confident. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence. Her statement, simple in construction yet profound in meaning, resonated deeply. It was a reminder that bravery and kindness were inseparable, that courage was often expressed through empathy, and that the smallest among us could see truths that adults frequently overlooked. The judge nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting admiration and quiet amazement. "Exactly, Emma," he said. "That is precisely what Rex does. And it is why your recognition of him is so important." The ripple effects continued. Spectators, once passive observers of routine legal proceedings, whispered to each other about the extraordinary courage of a child who had fearlessly confronted a highly trained dog. Lawyers, some of whom had spent years in heated debate and legal battles, paused to reflect on the simplicity and power of honesty and observation. Even officers, accustomed to navigating high-pressure situations, found themselves momentarily humbled by the quiet impact of a 3-year-old's fearless curiosity. Emma, emboldened by the collective attention and approval, reached out her tiny hand once more toward Rex. The dog, calm but responsive, allowed her proximity, acknowledging the trust and bravery inherent in the gesture. The courtroom collectively exhaled, sensing the profound connection forming before them. This small act, a child reaching out to a trained police dog, encapsulated lessons of courage, trust, and mutual respect that no lecture or legal precedent could replicate. Lily, her heart swelling with pride, whispered softly to her daughter, "You are amazing, honey." Emma smiled faintly, her attention still focused on Rex. She had not sought praise or recognition. Her actions were instinctive, born of observation, empathy, and innate courage. And yet, the courtroom had recognized the extraordinary impact of her small but fearless presence. The judge allowed a brief pause, letting the moment resonate fully. He adjusted his glasses, leaning slightly forward with a warmth rarely displayed in his courtroom. "Emma," he said gently, "you have reminded all of us that courage is not measured by size or age, but by action, honesty, and kindness. You have also reminded us that the lessons of bravery often come from the most unexpected places." Emma, tilting her head thoughtfully, reached her tiny hand toward Rex again, brushing lightly against his fur. The dog responded subtly, leaning into her touch without movement or sound, his amber eyes conveying trust and acknowledgement. The courtroom remained silent, every adult present fully aware that they were witnessing a rare and extraordinary exchange. Courage, empathy, and understanding expressed without ego, without words, and without pretense. Officers quietly exchanged glances, recognizing that this moment had left an indelible mark on their professional and personal perspectives. Lawyers, observing the quiet dignity and bravery of a 3-year-old, reflected on the simplicity of truth, honesty, and courage. Spectators whispered softly to each other, acknowledging that Emma had not only captured the attention of a trained police dog, but had also transformed the energy of the entire courtroom. The judge's voice softened further. "Emma, you have shown us all a lesson we should never forget. Bravery is not the absence of fear, but the courage to do what is right, even when we are small or uncertain. Kindness and honesty have power beyond measure, and today, you have reminded us all of that truth." Emma, absorbing the judge's words with wide-eyed focus, nodded slowly. Her understanding of bravery, kindness, and empathy had grown immensely, though she expressed it in simple, direct terms. She reached out again, this time patting Rex gently on the head. The dog remained calm, attentive, and responsive, acknowledging the courage, trust, and clarity of the small human before him. The courtroom had been profoundly transformed. Adults who had arrived expecting routine proceedings were now witnesses to a moment of genuine, unfiltered courage. Lawyers, officers, and spectators alike had been reminded that the truest forms of bravery, empathy, and influence could come from the most unexpected sources. And in the center of it all, Emma, tiny, fearless, and profoundly honest, had become the teacher, the guide, and the bridge between innocence and experience. Finally, as the day drew toward a temporary recess, the judge allowed a small smile to cross his face. "Emma," he said, "you have changed this courtroom today in ways that no one will forget. Thank you for showing us the power of honesty, curiosity, and courage." Emma smiled faintly, satisfied, her small hand resting again on her mother's arm. She had faced a trained police dog, engaged fearlessly with authority, and left a lasting impression on every adult present. The ripple effects of her bravery would continue to unfold, long after the echoes of the day faded. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer merely a place of law and procedure. It had become a sanctuary of courage, honesty, and empathy, a space where a small child's fearless curiosity had illuminated truths that even adults often overlooked. Emma, blissfully unaware of the depth of her influence, had achieved something extraordinary. She had taught an entire room full of adults a lesson in bravery, kindness, and the quiet power of innocence. As the courtroom recessed for a brief pause, the energy in the room remained charged. What had begun as an ordinary day of proceedings had transformed into an extraordinary display of courage, empathy, and human connection. Emma, perched quietly on her mother's lap, had become more than a spectator. She had become the center of a living lesson in bravery. The adults, lawyers, officers, and spectators, all had been touched by the fearless curiosity and unfiltered honesty of a 3-year-old. Emma's mother, Lily, glanced down at her daughter, a mixture of pride and awe washing over her. Emma had not merely interacted with Rex, the trained police dog. She had bridged worlds, reminding every adult present of truths often forgotten. Courage is not measured by age, size, or authority, but by the willingness to act honestly and with kindness. Lily gently brushed a strand of hair from Emma's forehead, whispering softly, "You've done something incredible today, honey." Emma simply smiled, her attention still partially on Rex, unaware of the scale of the impact she had made. The judge, observing the courtroom with a rare softness in his eyes, called the session to order once more. But the tone had shifted entirely. Where before formality and tension had dominated, now there was a quiet reverence, an unspoken acknowledgement of the extraordinary events that had unfolded. The judge's voice carried gently yet firmly. "Let us proceed, knowing that today has reminded us all of the power of courage, honesty, and kindness, no matter how small the source." Rex remained calm, his amber eyes flicking toward Emma occasionally, as if silently communicating respect and acknowledgement. The officer handling him adjusted his stance subtly, observing the bond that had formed between the child and the dog. In decades of training and public demonstrations, he had never witnessed such a pure, intuitive connection. Emma's presence had not only altered the energy of the courtroom, but had also reshaped perceptions of authority, trust, and bravery. Spectators who had initially been drawn by routine curiosity now whispered quietly among themselves. Conversations were filled with admiration, reflection, and soft expressions of astonishment. One woman murmured, "I've never seen anything like this. She's remarkable." A man beside her nodded, replying, "She's teaching all of us without even knowing it." Lawyers, pausing to absorb the moment, found themselves reconsidering the rigidity of their language, the harshness of procedural dominance, and the overlooked humanity in the people they interacted with daily. Emma, sensing the quiet attention, reached out her tiny hand to Rex once more. The dog, calm yet attentive, acknowledged her touch, reinforcing the unique bond that had grown between them. The courtroom seemed suspended in a delicate balance, a space where innocence and discipline, curiosity and authority, humanity and trained instinct intersected perfectly. It was a rare moment, one of those brief, fleeting experiences that left an indelible mark on everyone present. As the day progressed, the ripple effects of Emma's bravery began to spread beyond the immediate room. Officers approached witnesses and participants with softened expressions, their approach gentler, more empathetic. Lawyers, inspired by the simplicity and honesty of a child's engagement, chose their words with added care, realizing that the human element often carried more weight than any argument or technicality. Even the judge, long accustomed to procedural authority, reflected quietly on the profound lesson Emma had delivered, that bravery, honesty, and kindness were timeless values that transcended age and experience. Word of Emma's courage did not remain confined to the courtroom. Within hours, courthouse staff began sharing the story with colleagues, recounting the small girl who had fearlessly confronted a highly trained police dog and left the entire courtroom in quiet awe. Local reporters, already covering routine hearings, took note of the extraordinary event. Photographs captured the tiny girl's fearless gaze, the calm, disciplined dog, and the expressions of adults witnessing something rare and inspiring. Social media began to stir, with posts highlighting the courage and wisdom of someone so young. Back in the courtroom, Emma's mother observed the subtle admiration and respect that followed her daughter. Each gesture, each glance from an adult, reflected the quiet acknowledgement of a lesson learned. Courage was not about dominance, fearlessness, or authority. It was about sincerity, empathy, and action. Lily whispered softly, "Emma, you've shown everyone something extraordinary today," and her daughter's small smile seemed to acknowledge the truth of her words. Even Rex, trained to respond to commands and subtle cues, seemed to carry the memory of the interaction. When Emma reached out or whispered softly, the dog's calm responsiveness reflected a recognition of trust and bravery. The officer handling Rex, accustomed to countless public demonstrations and high-stress situations, marveled at the depth of the connection. He realized that the lessons Emma had imparted, the courage to act despite fear, the importance of kindness, and the power of observation, extended far beyond a single courtroom interaction. As the hearing resumed, Emma's impact remained evident. Officers moved with more patience, lawyers engaged with increased empathy, and spectators watched with a quiet sense of awe. Even technical aspects of the proceedings, which could have otherwise felt mechanical or detached, carried a renewed sense of humanity. Emma had reminded everyone that courage was not measured by size or authority, but by action, intention, and integrity. Later, during a brief recess, the judge approached Emma's mother. "Lily," he said quietly, "your daughter has reminded all of us of something we often forget. She has shown bravery, empathy, and clarity that even adults struggle to demonstrate. Today, she has taught this courtroom more than any ruling or procedure could." Lily nodded, overwhelmed by emotion. "I think she has taught more than even we realize," she replied softly. When the courtroom reconvened, Emma remained a quiet but powerful presence. Each question she asked, each glance she shared with Rex, continued to influence the behavior and mindset of those around her. Even routine interactions, signing documents, arranging seating, or handling exhibits, carried a subtle awareness of her influence. Adults found themselves more attentive, more patient, and more reflective, reminded that courage and empathy could be found in the most unexpected forms. By the end of the day, the impact of Emma's presence had become undeniable. The judge, officers, lawyers, and spectators carried the memory of her bravery long after the gavel struck for the final recess. Conversations outside the courtroom, both in hallways and in local cafes, revolved around the small girl who had fearlessly engaged with a trained police dog and reminded everyone of the timeless lessons of courage, honesty, and kindness. Photographs circulated online, news stories began to emerge, and the tale of Emma's bravery quickly became a symbol of inspiration for the wider community. Even Emma, blissfully unaware of the broader recognition, had absorbed the day's lessons. She had witnessed authority, discipline, and structured procedures, but she had also learned the importance of observation, empathy, and fearless curiosity. Through her interactions with Rex and the adults around her, she had internalized the essence of courage, not as the absence of fear, but as the strength to act with sincerity and kindness in the presence of it. As the courthouse emptied, the officers handling Rex lingered briefly, exchanging reflective glances. They had seen many demonstrations of discipline and training, but none carried the quiet, transformative power of what they had witnessed with Emma. The dog remained calm, obedient, and attentive, a living testament to the lessons of trust, bravery, and mutual respect that had unfolded. For Lily, the day had been unforgettable. Watching her daughter engage fearlessly, inspire adults, and form a bond with a trained police dog was an experience beyond measure. Emma had not only made her mother proud but had also left a lasting impression on an entire community. The lessons of courage, empathy, and honesty would ripple outward, affecting everyone who had witnessed or heard the story. In the days that followed, local news outlets covered the extraordinary courtroom event. Headlines celebrated Emma's courage, the calm professionalism of Rex, and the profound lessons learned by adults who had witnessed the interaction. Community members shared the story widely, praising the small child whose bravery reminded everyone that the most profound truths often come from the youngest, most unassuming sources. The courtroom itself, once dominated by procedure and formality, carried the lingering energy of that day for weeks. Officers approached interactions with renewed empathy, lawyers considered the human element more carefully, and spectators remembered the lesson of the small child who had fearlessly confronted a trained police dog and left a lasting impression. Emma's presence had transcended the ordinary, leaving a mark of courage and kindness that would not be forgotten. And in the quiet moments, when Emma played with her toys at home or asked questions about the world, the lessons of that extraordinary day, trust, bravery, empathy, and honesty, remained alive within her. The bond she had formed with Rex, the respect she had earned, and the influence she had had on every adult in the courtroom had become a subtle but powerful reminder of the enduring power of courage, even in the smallest of forms. In the end, the story of Emma and Rex became more than a courtroom anecdote. It became a testament to the quiet, transformative power of fearlessness, empathy, and honesty. A 3-year-old had reminded an entire courtroom of truths that often go unnoticed, proving that courage is not measured by size, authority, or experience, but by the heart and intention behind every action. And in that lesson, the world, for a brief but meaningful moment, had grown just a little wiser, kinder, and braver.